I never thought I would be at war with my neighbor over well water. But that's exactly what happened when Patricia from the HOA decided that my private well was suddenly community property. It all started during one of the worst winter storms Montana had seen in 20 years. I'm Keith Wright, and I'd been living on my 5-acre property outside of Bozeman for about 3 years at that point. When I bought the place, one of the main selling points was that it came with its own well, totally independent from the municipal water supply. I'd paid good money for that well, maintained it myself, and never thought twice about it until Patricia Hendricks knocked on my door that February morning. The temperature had dropped to -15 degrees overnight, and the forecast called for another week of sub-freezing weather with intermittent ice storms. I was in my kitchen, drinking coffee and watching the news about road closures, when I heard the aggressive pounding on my front door. I opened it to find Patricia standing there in her ridiculous white puffy coat that made her look like the Michelin Man. She was around 55, with that haircut that screamed HOA president, you know the one. Shoulder length, layered, with blonde highlights that were definitely not natural. Her lips were pursed so tight they'd nearly disappeared. "Keith, we need to talk about your well," she said, not even bothering with a greeting. "Good morning to you too, Patricia. What about my well? The HOA needs access to it. We're running low on water for the community ice melt system, and as a member of the Rolling Hills Estates, you're obligated to share resources during emergencies." I blinked at her, certain I'd misheard. "I'm sorry, what? My well is private property. It's not connected to anything in the development." "That may be true, but we have a clause in the HOA bylaws about community cooperation during natural disasters. This ice situation qualifies. We need to run a line from your well to our distribution system for the ice melt sprayers we've installed along the main roads." I'd heard about those sprayers. The HOA had spent something like $40,000 installing this elaborate system that was supposed to spray a water and salt mixture onto the roads to prevent ice buildup. Seemed like a massive waste of money to me, which is exactly why I'd been grateful my property was technically outside the main development boundaries. I only paid into the HOA because my driveway connected to one of their roads, a technicality that had been grandfathered in when the previous owner had agreed to it. "Patricia, that's not happening. That well supplies water to my house. It's my personal property, and I'm not running a line to your system." Her face turned red, which was quite a sight against the white coat. "This is not a request, Keith. This is a mandate from the HOA board. We've already voted, and it was unanimous. You have 24 hours to comply, or we'll be forced to take action." "What action? You can't legally force me to give you access to my well. That's not how property rights work." "We'll see about that," she snapped, then turned and marched back to her black Escalade, which she'd left running in my driveway, belching exhaust into the frozen air. I closed the door and stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Then I did what any reasonable person would do. I called my lawyer. Tom Davidson had handled the closing on my property, and he was familiar with all the quirks of my situation with the HOA. He listened to my story and was quiet for a moment. "She said it was in the bylaws," he finally asked. "That's what she claimed. Something about resource sharing during emergencies. I'll pull up your HOA documents and take a look. But off the top of my head, I'm 99% sure that's garbage. Your well is not an HOA asset. It was here before the development was even built. Give me a few hours and I'll call you back." Tom called back 3 hours later. "Yeah, she's full of it. There's nothing in the bylaws about commandeering private wells. There's a generic clause about cooperation during emergencies, but it's related to things like allowing emergency vehicles access through private roads, stuff like that. Nothing about water rights. So what do I do? Nothing. If they try to access your property without permission, that's trespassing. If they try to force the issue, we'll get an injunction. Just document everything and let me know if they escalate. They escalated. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of machinery on my property. I threw on clothes and rushed outside to find a contractor's truck parked near my well house, and two guys were actually starting to dig a trench line from my well toward the road. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" I shouted, running through the snow. One of the guys, a younger man in his 20s with a scrappy beard, looked up. "HOA contract, man. We're just doing what we were hired to do." "Well, I'm the property owner and I'm telling you to stop, right now." The other worker, older and clearly the one in charge, pulled out his phone. "Let me call Patricia." I waited while he made the call, my breath making clouds in the frigid air. He talked for a minute, nodding, then handed me the phone. "Keith, don't make this difficult," Patricia's voice came through. "We have the authority to do this." "No, you don't." I spoke with my lawyer. "You have no legal right to access my well, and these men are trespassing on my property. If you interfere with HOA operations, we'll be forced to fine you, $500 per day until you comply. Fine me for protecting my own property." "Good luck with that, Patricia. Now tell your contractors to leave before I call the sheriff." There was a pause. "You wouldn't try me. You've got about 30 seconds before I dial." She hung up. The contractor looked at his phone, then at me, then sighed. "She says to hold off for now." "We'll pack up." "Good choice." They left, but I knew this wasn't over. I took photos of the small trench they'd started and sent them to Tom, along with a detailed email about what had happened. He responded within the hour, saying he was drafting a cease and desist letter to the HOA. That evening, I got a visit from 3 HOA board members. Patricia, a guy named Douglas Mills who was the treasurer, and Wendy Jenkins, the secretary. They showed up together like some kind of suburban intimidation squad. "Keith, we need to have a serious conversation," Douglas said. He was in his 60s, retired from something finance-related, and always wore sweaters that looked like they cost more than my monthly grocery bill. "I'm listening," I said, not inviting them in. Wendy, who was actually pretty reasonable most of the time, spoke up. "The thing is, our ice melt system is using way more water than we anticipated. The temperatures have been so extreme that we're having to run it almost constantly. The municipal supply we tapped into isn't enough, and they've actually asked us to reduce usage because of strain on the city system." "That sounds like a planning problem on the HOA's part," I said. "Not my problem," Patricia cut in. "It becomes your problem when the roads ice over and emergency services can't get through. What if there's a fire? What if someone has a heart attack? The main highway is kept clear by the state. Emergency services can access this area just fine without your ice melt system. Maybe you should have thought about water supply before you installed this thing." Douglas pulled out some papers. "We've consulted with our attorney, and he believes we have grounds to claim emergency access to your well under Montana state law regarding disaster preparedness." "Really? Because my attorney says you don't, so I guess we're at an impasse." The three of them exchanged looks. Patricia's jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscles working. "This isn't over, Keith. One way or another we will get access to that water." "Is that a threat?" "It's a promise." After they left, I went out to my well house and installed a padlock on the door. It was a sturdy little building, basically a small shed that housed the wellhead, pressure tank, and all the associated equipment. I'd always kept it unlocked because, well, why would anyone mess with it? But clearly, that needed to change. I also installed a motion-activated camera that covered the well house and the area around it. If anyone tried anything, I'd have video evidence. For 2 days, things were quiet. The temperature stayed brutally cold, and I watched from my window as the HOA's ice melt system ran constantly on the roads. I could see the sprayers going, misting the pavement with their water and salt mixture. It actually worked pretty well. The main road through the development stayed relatively ice-free, while the surrounding areas were skating rinks. But I also noticed the water pressure seemed to be decreasing. The mist from the sprayers wasn't as strong as it had been initially. On the 3rd day, I got a certified letter from the HOA. It was a formal notice that I was being fined $500 per day for failure to comply with emergency protocols, and that if I didn't pay or grant access to my well within 7 days, they would place a lien on my property. I immediately forwarded it to Tom, who called me right away. "This is absolute nonsense," he said, and I could hear the anger in his voice. "They can't just invent fines for made-up violations. I'm filing a motion with the court for an injunction against the HOA. This has gone way too far." "How long will that take?" "Emergency injunction. We might be able to get a hearing within a few days. In the meantime, do not pay these fines, do not grant access to the well, and document everything." That night, my cameras picked up movement around 11 p.m. I was still awake, reading in bed, when my phone buzzed with the alert. I pulled up the camera feed and saw 2 figures approaching the well house with bolt cutters. I grabbed my phone and coat and ran outside, flipping on my exterior floodlights as I went. The 2 people froze in the sudden brightness. I recognized one of them immediately, Patricia's husband, Gerald. The other was someone I'd seen at HOA meetings but didn't know by name. "That's breaking and entering," I called out. "I've got you on camera and I'm calling the sheriff right now." "That well should be community property," Gerald shouted back. He was a big guy, former military, and he looked ready for a confrontation. I was already dialing. "Gallatin County Sheriff's Department. Yes, I need to report a trespassing and attempted breaking and entering in progress." I gave them my address and stayed on the line while Gerald and his accomplice had a heated, whispered conversation. Finally, they dropped the bolt cutters and walked quickly back toward the road where they'd apparently parked. A deputy arrived about 15 minutes later. I showed him the video footage and he took a report. "Do you want to press charges?" he asked. "I want it documented," I said. "I'm in the middle of a legal dispute with the HOA and I need a record of this." "Understood." I recognize Gerald Hendricks. "I'll pay him a visit and make it clear that he needs to stay off your property." "I'd appreciate that." After the deputy left, I went back inside and couldn't sleep. This whole situation was spiraling into something ridiculous. All over water for an ice melt system that the HOA had installed without proper planning. The next morning, I got a call from an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Keith, right?" a man's voice asked. "Speaking." "This is James Morrison. I'm the attorney representing Rolling Hills Estates, HOA. I wanted to reach out and see if we could resolve this matter without further legal action. Your client is trying to steal my water and has now attempted to break into my well house. I'd say we're past the point of friendly resolution. I understand you're upset, but surely we can come to some arrangement. The HOA is willing to compensate you for water usage. We're thinking $100 per month for the duration of the emergency." I actually laughed. $100. My well pump and system cost me $6,000 to upgrade when I bought this place. The electricity to run the pump constantly would be more than $100. Never mind the wear and tear on the equipment or the fact that I'd be depleting my own water source. "What figure would you find acceptable?" There is no figure. The answer is no. My well is not for sale, rent, or loan. Tell your clients to solve their own water problem. Mr. Wright, I want to be very clear. If you continue to obstruct the HOA's emergency operations, we will pursue every legal avenue available, including criminal charges for reckless endangerment. Reckless endangerment? Are you kidding me? If someone is injured or dies because emergency vehicles cannot navigate the iced roads, and it's determined that you prevented the HOA from operating their safety systems, you could be held liable. That's the most ridiculous legal theory I've ever heard. The state maintains the main roads. The HOA's vanity ice melt project is not an emergency service. We'll let a judge decide that. Good day, Mr. Wright. He hung up, and I immediately called Tom to relay the conversation. Reckless endangerment, Tom said, his tone incredulous. That's laughable. They're grasping at straws. But it does tell me they're feeling desperate, which means we need to be careful. Desperate people do stupid things. The hearing for the injunction was scheduled for 4 days later. In the meantime, I went out and checked my well system. Everything looked fine. The water level in the well was good and all the equipment was running smoothly. But that afternoon, I noticed something odd. I turned on my kitchen faucet, and the water came out with a weird metallic taste. I tested several other taps in the house. Same thing. The water had been perfectly fine that morning. I went out to the well house and did a more thorough inspection. At first, I didn't see anything wrong. Then I noticed fresh scratches on the ground-level vent pipe that allowed air into the well system. The pipe had a standard screen to keep debris out, but the screen looked like it had been removed and replaced. My stomach dropped. I put on gloves and carefully removed the screen. There was a strong chemical smell coming from the pipe. Someone had poured something into my well. I immediately shut off the well pump and called the sheriff's department again. Then I called Tom. Then I called a well service company that did emergency calls. The deputy who responded this time was the same one who'd come when Gerald tried to break in. He took one whiff of the vent pipe and called for a supervisor. By evening, I had the sheriff himself, Martin Crawford, on my property along with 2 other deputies and the well service technician. We're going to need to take samples, Sheriff Crawford said. This is potentially criminal contamination of a water supply, which is a serious felony in Montana. The technician, a weathered guy in his 50s named Bob, looked grim. I can tell you right now, just from the smell, someone's poured some kind of solvent or chemical down here. Your well is going to need to be pumped out completely and probably treated before it's safe to use again. We're talking thousands of dollars in damage. I felt sick. How long will I be without water? Best case, a week. Worst case. If the contamination has seeped into the aquifer, you might need a whole new well. Sheriff Crawford was on his radio calling in investigators. Within an hour, my property was a crime scene. They took samples from the well, photographed everything, and dusted the vent pipe for fingerprints. Do you have any idea who might have done this? Crawford asked me. I told him about the ongoing dispute with the HOA, about Gerald's attempted break-in, about Patricia's threats. I showed him the camera footage from the previous incidents. But the cameras didn't catch this, he asked. The vent pipe is on the back side of the well house, outside the camera's field of view. I didn't think anyone would go after the well itself. I thought they'd try to tap into the output line or break into the building. Crawford nodded slowly. I'm going to need copies of all your documentation regarding this dispute. This has escalated beyond a civil matter. He sent a deputy to interview the Hendricks that evening. I wasn't present for it, but Crawford called me later that night with an update. Gerald Hendricks has an alibi for today. He was at work in Bozeman from 7 this morning until 6 this evening, verified by multiple coworkers and security footage. Patricia claims she was home all day, but there's no one to corroborate that. What about their accomplice from the other night, Raymond Fuller? We haven't located him yet, but we're working on it. The next morning, I had to drive into town to buy bottled water for basic needs. The well service company had started the process of pumping out my contaminated well. Bob told me the preliminary test showed someone had poured at least 5 gallons of antifreeze into the system. It's nasty stuff, he said. Ethylene glycol could have killed you if you drunk enough of it. As it is, you're lucky you noticed the taste right away. Can you fix it? Yeah, but like I said, it's going to take time and money. Probably around $8 grand when all's said and done. I called Tom with the update. We need to add this to our filing. The HOA's harassment has resulted in felony criminal activity, and you've suffered significant property damage. We're going to own them when this is done. The injunction hearing was now 2 days away. That evening I got a call from Wendy Jenkins, the HOA secretary. Keith, I need to talk to you off the record, she said, her voice quiet. Okay. I didn't know what Patricia was planning. None of this was supposed to happen. The board meeting where we supposedly voted to demand access to your well, that was just Patricia and Douglas. They didn't even tell me about it until afterward, and when I objected, Patricia said it was already decided. Why are you telling me this? Because I'm resigning from the board, and I think you should know that Patricia has completely lost it. She's convinced that if the ice melt system fails and someone gets hurt, she'll be personally liable. She's obsessed with getting water from somewhere, anywhere, to keep the system running. Obsessed enough to poison my well. There was a long pause. I don't know. I want to say no, but honestly, I don't know anymore. She's been acting erratic. Yesterday, she screamed at Douglas for 20 minutes because he suggested we just turn off the ice melt system and let the county handle road maintenance like they usually do. Has she said anything that might suggest she was involved in contaminating my well? Not directly. But I heard her on the phone with someone yesterday afternoon, and she said something like, "He can't use what he won't share." It stuck with me as odd. Would you be willing to testify to that? Another pause. If it comes to that, yes, I'm done covering for her. This has gone way too far. After we hung up, I immediately called Sheriff Crawford and relayed the conversation. He said it was helpful but circumstantial. They needed more concrete evidence. That evidence came the next morning in the form of a security camera I didn't know existed. My neighbor to the east, an older woman named Dolores Martinez who lived on a large property similar to mine, called me around 10 a.m. Keith, I heard about what happened to your well. I think I might have footage of who did it. You have cameras that cover my property. Not exactly. But I have one that covers my driveway, and you can see part of the access road that runs between our properties in the shot. I checked the footage from yesterday, and there's a black Escalade driving past around 2 in the afternoon, heading toward your place. Then it comes back about 20 minutes later. My heart started racing. Patricia drives a black Escalade. I know. That's why I'm calling. I'm sending the footage to you now. The footage showed exactly what Dolores described. The license plate wasn't clearly visible, but the vehicle was distinctive enough. I forwarded it to Sheriff Crawford immediately. 2 hours later, deputies arrested Patricia Hendricks on suspicion of felony criminal mischief and contamination of a water supply. The arrest happened at her home, and apparently she completely lost it, screaming about how I was endangering the community and how she'd done what needed to be done. Those statements were enough for them to get a search warrant for her house and vehicle. In her garage, they found an empty antifreeze container and boots that had traces of the same chemical. Tom called me that evening with an update on the legal front. With Patricia under arrest, the HOA's attorney has reached out about settling. They want to drop all fines, pay for your well restoration, and agree to a permanent injunction against accessing your property. What about damages for harassment and emotional distress? I told them we want $50,000 on top of the well restoration costs. They're considering it. And what about the criminal case? That's separate. Patricia is looking at serious charges. The prosecutor is talking about 5 years minimum if she's convicted. The injunction hearing still went forward, if only to formalize the agreement. The judge listened to both sides, reviewed the evidence, and ruled decisively in my favor. The HOA was permanently barred from accessing my well. All fines were voided, and they were ordered to pay my legal fees plus damages. Douglas Mills attended the hearing on behalf of the HOA. Patricia was still in custody, unable to make bail because the judge considered her a risk to public safety. After the hearing, Douglas approached me in the hallway. "I owe you an apology," he said, looking genuinely remorseful. "This whole thing spiraled out of control. Patricia became fixated on this water issue and I didn't push back hard enough. I should have shut it down from the beginning." "Yeah, you should have. For what it's worth, we're shutting down the ice melt system. It was a bad idea from the start. Too expensive, too complex, and apparently it turned Patricia into a criminal. We're going back to traditional road salt and plowing, probably for the best." He hesitated, then added, "The board is voting next week to remove Patricia as president permanently, even if she beats the criminal charges. She's done." Over the next week, things slowly returned to normal. Bob and his crew finished cleaning out my well. The antifreeze had contaminated the upper levels but hadn't reached the aquifer, which was lucky. They treated the entire system, ran water through it for days, and tested it repeatedly until it was safe. The total bill came to $7,800. The HOA paid it immediately, along with the $50,000 in damages Tom had negotiated. After legal fees, I cleared about $37,000. Not a fortune, but enough to compensate for the weeks of stress and hassle. Patricia's criminal trial was scheduled for 4 months later. In the meantime, she was released on bail with strict conditions that she not contact me or come within 500 feet of my property. The prosecutor was confident about the case, given her statements at the time of arrest and the physical evidence. I attended the trial when it happened. It lasted 3 days. Patricia's defense attorney tried to argue that she'd been acting under extreme stress and concern for public safety, but the prosecutor dismantled that argument systematically. He showed that the ice melt system was never an essential emergency service, that the HOA had other options, and that contaminating my well put my life in danger. The jury convicted her on all counts after just 2 hours of deliberation. The judge sentenced her to 4 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole after 2. She also had to pay restitution directly to me for additional damages, though I doubted I'd ever see that money. Gerald divorced her 6 months into her sentence. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that he moved to Wyoming to be closer to his daughter from a previous marriage. The HOA, for its part, underwent a complete transformation. Douglas stepped down as treasurer, feeling responsible for enabling Patricia's behavior. A whole new board was elected, and one of their first acts was to formally apologize to me at a community meeting. I didn't attend, but they sent me a written copy of the resolution. They also revised the bylaws to add explicit protections for private property rights, and to prevent the board from taking unilateral action without proper member votes. Wendy Jenkins, true to her word, had already resigned before all of this, but she testified at Patricia's trial about the lack of proper procedure. My relationship with the HOA remained cordial but distant. I paid my minimal dues for road access, attended exactly 0 meetings, and otherwise kept to myself. They never bothered me again about anything. The well incident became something of a local legend in Bozeman. I'd occasionally be at the hardware store or a restaurant, and someone would recognize me and want to hear the story firsthand. It became a cautionary tale about HOAs overstepping their authority. About a year after everything settled, I was doing some maintenance on the well house when a car pulled into my driveway. It was a young couple, maybe early 30s, and they looked nervous. "Can I help you?" I asked, walking over. "Are you Keith Wright?" the woman asked. "That's me. We're looking at a house in Rolling Hills Estates, and the realtor mentioned what happened with you and the HOA. We wanted to hear your side before we decided whether to buy there." I smiled. It wasn't the first time someone had done this. "Come on up to the porch. I'll tell you the whole story." We sat on my porch for about 30 minutes while I explained everything that had happened. They listened intently, asking occasional questions. "So, would you recommend against buying in that development?" the man asked when I finished. "No, actually. The current board is solid. They learned from this mess, and they've put safeguards in place. Just make sure you read the bylaws carefully, know your property rights, and don't be afraid to push back if something seems wrong. Most HOA problems come from people letting little things slide until they become big things." "That's good advice," the woman said. "Thank you for your time." "No problem. Good luck with the house hunting." They left and I went back to my maintenance work. The well system was running perfectly, providing clean, cold water just like it always had. My water, on my property. Protected by law and common sense. That evening, I was sitting on my porch watching the sunset when Tom called. "Hey Keith, just wanted to give you a heads up. Patricia filed an appeal on her conviction. Is it going anywhere? Extremely unlikely. Her grounds are that the judge gave improper jury instructions, but I've read the transcript. The instructions were textbook perfect. Her appellate attorney is just going through the motions. So it's really over. It's really over. You won, she lost, and justice was served." "How's the well running?" I looked over at the well house, its new lock gleaming in the fading light. "Perfect. Absolutely perfect." "Good. You earned it, literally fought for it." After we hung up, I stayed on the porch as the temperature dropped and the stars came out. Montana winters were still brutal, and there would be more ice storms, more sub-freezing nights. But my well would keep running, providing water for my home and only my home. The Rolling Hills Estates development was visible from my porch, a cluster of houses with their warm lights glowing in the dusk. Their roads were maintained the old-fashioned way now, with salt trucks and plows, just like every other neighborhood in Montana. The elaborate ice melt system had been completely removed, sold for scrap to help offset the legal costs the HOA had incurred. I sometimes wondered if things could have gone differently if Patricia had just accepted my first no. If she'd acknowledged that my well was private property and found another solution to her water problem. But people like Patricia don't think that way. They see something they want, they decide they're entitled to it, and they can't comprehend why anyone would refuse them. In her mind, I was being selfish by not sharing my water. In reality, I was simply exercising my legal property rights. The fact that she couldn't distinguish between those two things had cost her everything: her position, her reputation, her freedom, and ultimately her marriage. It was a steep price to pay for stubbornness and entitlement. The next morning, I got an email from Bob, the well technician who'd fixed my system. He was starting a new business venture, offering well security consultations for property owners. He wanted to use my case as an example in his marketing materials and asked for permission. I agreed, on the condition that he change my name and location in any public materials. I'd had enough attention from the situation. But if my experience could help other property owners protect their wells from overzealous HOAs or vandals, that seemed like something positive coming from the whole mess. Winter gradually gave way to spring. The ice melted, the roads cleared, and life in Montana returned to its regular rhythm. I started a garden that year, something I'd been meaning to do since I bought the property. Tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, herbs. I ran drip irrigation lines from my well, and everything grew beautifully. One Saturday in June, I was out working in the garden when I saw Wendy Jenkins walking up my driveway. We'd exchanged a few polite words at the grocery store since everything happened, but she'd never visited my property. "Keith, I hope I'm not intruding," she said as she approached. "Not at all." "What brings you by?" "I wanted to thank you, actually, and apologize." "Thank me for what?" "For not backing down. I was complicit in what Patricia was doing, even if I didn't actively participate. I should have resigned the moment she started targeting you. Instead, I waited until things got criminal. That was cowardly." I wiped dirt off my hands and stood up. "You did testify at the trial. That took courage." "It was the least I could do, but I've been thinking a lot about why I went along with her for so long. I think it was because she was so confident, so certain she was right. It's easy to get swept up in that." "Groupthink is powerful," I agreed. "It is. Anyway, I wanted you to know that I'm sorry, and I wanted to give you this." She handed me an envelope. Inside was a check for $5,000. "Wendy, what is this?" "It's my share of responsibility. The HOA paid your damages, but I want to pay you personally for my part in the harassment. I know it doesn't undo anything, but it's important to me." I tried to hand it back. "You don't need to do this. You weren't the one who poisoned my well." "But I was part of the system that enabled Patricia. Please take it. It'll help me sleep better at night." I could see this mattered to her, so I accepted the check. "Thank you. That's genuinely kind of you." We talked for a few more minutes, and she admired my garden before leaving. I watched her walk back to her car, thinking about how differently people respond when they're held accountable. Patricia had doubled down, blamed everyone else, and ended up in prison. Wendy had acknowledged her mistakes, made amends, and would probably come out of this as a better person. I deposited her check and used the money to install solar panels on my well house. It seemed fitting, turning a gesture of apology into something that would reduce my electrical costs for running the well pump. The system paid for itself in about 3 years and made my well operation almost entirely self-sufficient. Life continued. I dated someone for a while, a teacher from Bozeman named Rachel, but it didn't work out. I adopted a dog, a golden retriever mix from the shelter named Murphy, who loved running around my 5 acres and drinking from his bowl filled with pristine well water. The Rolling Hills Estates HOA continued to function with its new board and new attitude. Property values in the area actually increased after Patricia's conviction, partly because the story attracted buyers who liked the idea of an HOA that had learned its lesson about overreach. I ran into Douglas Mills at a coffee shop about 2 years after the trial. We hadn't spoken since the courthouse hallway conversation. He was with a woman I didn't recognize, and they were laughing about something when I walked in. He saw me, and his expression became serious. He said something to the woman, then walked over to me. "Keith, how are you?" "Good, you?" "Better. This is probably weird, but would you want to sit with us for a few minutes? There's someone I'd like you to meet." I was curious, so I agreed. The woman stood as we approached the table. She was around Douglas's age, with gray hair and a warm smile. "Keith, This is Barbara Reynolds. She's a mediator specializing in HOA disputes. I've been working with her on a consulting basis to help other HOAs avoid the kind of disaster we had. We shook hands. Interesting career, I said. It is. Douglas has been invaluable in helping me understand how board members can lose perspective. Your case is actually one we study. With your permission and with names changed, we use it in training seminars. It's a perfect example of escalation, boundary violations, and how ego can override common sense. I suppose I don't mind as long as my name isn't attached. We ended up talking for over an hour. Barbara was genuinely interested in my perspective, asking detailed questions about how the HOA could have approached things differently. What would I have done if they'd come to me respectfully? Would I have been willing to sell water under any circumstances? What warning signs should board members watch for in their own behavior? I answered honestly. If they'd approached me respectfully, explained their problem, and offered reasonable compensation without demands or threats, I might have considered a limited arrangement. Not unlimited access to my well, but maybe filling their tank trucks once a week for a fair price. The key word being might. I still would have been well within my rights to refuse. But the moment they started with threats and demands, I said, they guaranteed I would never cooperate. It became about principle at that point. Barbara nodded, taking notes. That's the pattern we see repeatedly. HOAs think they have more authority than they actually do. They lead with threats instead of negotiation, and they create enemies out of people who might have been willing to help. Douglas looked uncomfortable. I've replayed that first board meeting so many times in my head. If I'd just spoken up and told Patricia she was wrong, none of this would have happened. Maybe, I said, or maybe she would have done it anyway behind your back. People like Patricia don't take no for an answer. Have you heard anything about her? Barbara asked. I know that's probably inappropriate to ask. She got paroled after 18 months, I said. Good behavior, I guess. Last I heard, she moved to Idaho to live with her sister. Hopefully, she's learned something. We parted on good terms, and it felt like another piece of closure. Even Douglas, who'd been part of the problem, had turned his mistake into something constructive. He was helping other HOAs avoid the same pitfalls. Years passed. The well kept running. Murphy got older and was eventually joined by a puppy named Scout. I renovated my house, adding a greenhouse that let me garden year-round using well water and geothermal heating. Life was good. Then one day, about 5 years after Patricia's conviction, I got a letter forwarded through Tom's office. It was from Patricia. I almost threw it away without reading it, but curiosity won out. The letter was handwritten on plain paper, dated 2 weeks earlier. Dear Keith, it began. You don't know me anymore, and I'm not sure you ever really did. The woman who harassed you and poisoned your well was someone I don't recognize when I look back. Prison gave me a lot of time to think about who I'd become and why I thought I had the right to do what I did to you. I'm not writing to ask for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I'm writing because my therapist suggested that making amends, even if they're not accepted, is part of moving forward. So here is my amend. I was completely wrong. Your well was your property. You had every right to refuse my demands. I let my fear of being blamed for the ice melt system's failure override my ethics and my sanity. I've lost everything because of my actions, and that's justice. I deserved to lose it all. What I didn't deserve was the community's support I'd had before I destroyed it through my own arrogance. I hope your well still runs strong. I hope you never think of me. And I hope that somehow, sharing my story helps other people avoid becoming what I became. I don't expect a response. I just needed you to know that I finally understand what I did, and I'm sorry. Patricia Hendricks. I read the letter twice, then set it aside. I didn't feel angry anymore. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt tired thinking about the whole situation. I never responded to the letter. There was nothing to say. She was right that she didn't deserve forgiveness, but more than that, she didn't need anything from me. Her amends were her own to make, with herself and whatever higher power she believed in. I filed the letter away in a folder with all the other documentation from the case, a folder I kept in a drawer and rarely opened. It was history now, a story I occasionally told when people asked, but not something that defined my life. The well kept running, season after season, year after year. It provided clean water for my home, my garden, and my animals. It was mine, legally and morally, protected by the law and by my willingness to stand up for what was right. Standing on my porch now, almost 7 years after that February morning when Patricia first knocked on my door, I can see how much has changed. The Rolling Hills Estates development has grown slightly, with new houses on the far edge. The HOA functions smoothly with term limits and strict protocols. Property values have climbed steadily, and my 5 acres remain exactly as they should be. Mine. Every fence post, every tree, every blade of grass, and every drop of water that comes from the ground beneath my feet. Sometimes I think about what I would tell my younger self, standing in that doorway with Patricia demanding access to the well. I'd tell him that he did everything right. That standing firm on principle, even when it's inconvenient and stressful, is always worth it. That documentation and good legal counsel are worth their weight in gold. And that sometimes the only way to deal with unreasonable people is to refuse to be reasonable in return. But mostly, I'd tell him what I know now, that some battles are worth fighting not because of what you gain, but because of what you refuse to lose. In this case, I refuse to lose my property rights, my autonomy, and my right to say no. The well keeps running, cold and clear and mine. And that's exactly how it should be.